Nothing But the Truth. Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa of India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. This is my weekly X-ray of key issues that matter to you without holding back on the truth. The conventional marker for India to become a Viksit Bharat or a developed country by 2047 is its per capita gross domestic product or GDP. Now, experts say that nations that have crossed the threshold of $20,000 as its annual per capita GDP, that amounts to around rupees 17.26 lakhs, are considered eligible to be positioned as developed countries. By the way, China with a per capita GDP of $13,000 is well below that mark and still does not qualify as a developed country. And India with $2,700 per capita GDP has still a long way to go to achieve Viksit Bharat status. However, per capita GDP is not the only criterion to ensure that a nation becomes a developed country. There are other factors too, including having a high Human Development Index or HDI that straddles issues such as health and education. As important is having world-class infrastructure that facilitates both ease of living and of business. But, and this is a big but, there is another important factor that rarely shows up in official figures or can be quantified. This week in India Today magazine, we propose that in addition to GDP, we should measure a country's what we call gross domestic behavior or GDP. Now, the GDP or gross domestic behavior ensures that through certain norms of civic and social attitudes, a country's progress would be speeded up as well as its productivity could be improved substantially. Unfortunately, the palpable lack of civic sense in many quarters in India is often taken as part of our nature. To quantify it, therefore, India Today magazine collaborated with data analytics agency called How India Lives and brought out a pioneering survey that measures India's overall GDP on key issues as well as which states perform better than the others on such criteria. Now, the survey was conducted across 21 states and 1 union territory, and over 9,000 respondents were interviewed, and we sought to gauge the attitudes across 4 dimensions. The first is civic behavior, and we'll come to more of that. Second is public safety. Third is gender attitudes, and the fourth is diversity and discrimination. Now, on these 4 parameters is what the entire questionnaires were based on, and the survey produced startling revelations about our gross domestic behavior. So in this episode of Nothing But the Truth, we would analyze the findings of this first of its kind report on India's gross domestic behavior and its implications. And at this stage, I'm delighted to welcome a well-known sociologist, Dipankar Gupta, a former professor at JNU's Center of the Study of Social Systems. And so, Dipankar Gupta, welcome to Nothing But the Truth.
Thank you. Hello, Raj.
Thanks, Dipankar, for being with me. I know you've taken time out to talk to us, and that's we're truly grateful with that. And let me begin by giving you some of the findings of the first part of the survey, which deals with civic behavior. I'm giving you the questions, and then I'll get your reactions on that. One of the questions that we asked in the survey is, and I'm quoting the survey, is it acceptable to travel on public transport like buses or railways without a ticket or without paying the fare? And surprisingly, of course, not surprisingly, 85% said no, and yet 14%, or say 1 out of 9 respondents, thought it was okay. And in a state like Punjab, as many as 54% thought it was okay to travel in a public transport without having a ticket or paying the fare. Then we asked another question which deals with civic behavior, which is it okay to throw litter of garbage on the road or in a public place if no public garbage bin is available? Here again, 86% said we shouldn't do so, but in Punjab, as many as 43% said it was fine to throw garbage on the road. And another revealing question was whether it was necessary to pay bribes to get your work done. Here, as many as 61% agreed there was a need to pay a bribe, a stunning revelation of how inured we have become to corruption in public life. And in fact, in Uttar Pradesh, it was even higher, with 94% survey saying they were ready to pay a bribe. So, Dipankar Gupta, what is the sense you get out of such behavior? I've given you three examples. Some of them seem predictable. We are against littering, but is that a posture? Is that we know a lot of when we look at our roads, we know there's a lot of garbage being thrown on the streets. That's there. So also with ticketless travels, we have seen how the railways has prosecuted, and the bus people have also bus drivers and other prosecuted people for not having tickets without paying for it.
Well, you
What's your
see,
sense?
in my view, uh, surveys of this kind have a basic problem which inhabits all such surveys, and that is when you ask person a question, which is like a leading question, like do you travel ticketless? The answer will be one which is well rehearsed, and they sort of sit up and say, well, what should be the answer, and respond accordingly. So there will be a big gulf between what people say and what people do. In fact, all of social science, if I'm not mistaken, is probably based on this gap between what people say and what people do. And this is the real problem that I encountered when I was looking through the data here. So, of course, they'll say that we shouldn't litter. But the next moment, they're probably littering away. This happens all the time. And this is not
Right.
just with people who are rural or uneducated. I've seen, very well-educated, well-heeled people doing the same thing, leaning out of their car doors and spitting, for example.
Right.
I had thought that when COVID had happened, I had thought that people may have learned a lesson in hygiene, but it didn't really last very long. They kept the mask on, yes, but soon as COVID fear lifted, so did the mask. So I think in terms of what people actually do and what they say they do, there's always a big gap. And as you may have also noticed, it is quite interesting that there's such wide discrepancies sometimes between states, and it's very difficult to explain. But nevertheless, what comes through at the end of the day, in my view, is that everybody or large sections of India's population know what is the right thing to do. And this is a very big finding. In spite of all the wrinkles in the survey and all of the problems that people usually encounter in such exercises, what has come through loud and clear is that people generally know what is the right thing to do and what is correct civic behavior. Now
Right.
the question is, why don't they follow it up? I think here the problem really is not of dinning truths into people's heads, but making sure that the law is enforced rigorously and impartially. And that's the only thing that I draw from your survey. And also to make the point that it is not as if India alone requires the stick. This is true of countries across the world, including Western Europe and America. Spitting was very common out there until they had a kind of a spitting police, that went about fining people rigorously for this behavior. When Charles Dickens went to America, he was shocked at the way Americans would spit around, and he thought this was so gross and ungentlemanly. But over time, it is enforcement really that does the trick.
That's a very good point, and I'd just like to take. I mean, enforcement is also, a very, very important part of ensuring that people observe these civic necessities. But take a look at another question that we'd asked. If and this is the question: if you witness an accident, will you stop to help and call the police or an ambulance? Now, a high 88% say that we should, but government statistics show that 50% of road fatalities could have been prevented with timely medical attention within the first hour. So this does not quite fit into what you were saying, about, for instance, you can't impose this on people, right? You can't make it mandatory that you have to help accident victims when they're there. People are worried about the law, people are worried about getting involved, or they're just too busy. It's unfortunate. I mean, you should be doing it. That's the general sentiment that you express. So what do we do in situations like that, where how do you then bring about a culture of helping people, of a kinder, gentler nation, if you'd like to put it that way?
Well, this is a very difficult task, I'm sure, and you have probably seen it in a number of situations. And I've noticed this across the world too. People don't want to stop and help. Somebody is being raped or beaten up or mugged, and others just walk away. They don't want to be part of the scene. I've often asked myself, is it because they don't want to be involved with the legal process, or they just don't care, they want to, have a break in their stride while going to office or to work or to party? I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but I do think that there's a certain degree of atomization in our society, not just our society, in urban societies, societies across the world. And this is not pointing a finger at urban people, but just that the kind of community feeling that is engendered, like it or not, in a rural setup, in tradition at least, that is missing. So we don't know the other person well. And because we don't know the other person, therefore we don't want to help either. You will find that people give money to charity to issues that they can identify with, and the people too who are involved. If they don't know the person, they will not part with their
Right.
money. So there's a great degree of, shall we say, rapport that's required in advance. Now, in a city, the civic issues being what they are, you can't know everybody. You can't even know 1/20th of the population. So there is
Right.
something big that just has to be done, and what it is, I don't know. But I think that if police procedures were made easier and more friendly, then perhaps more people perhaps join in and complain, or at least raise an alarm and alert the authorities when there's an accident. And in many of the India Today surveys, I found quite happily that they also gave blurbs like this, like you just mentioned, that this is what people say and this is actually what people do. If they had actually reported, then 50% of fatalities may not have occurred.
Right. Now, let's look at the second section, and I'll come back to what you had said about the atomization of society and seemingly lack of compassion when you look at big issues like this. And let's look at the second section that looks at public safety. And again, here you'd see that we asked if eve teasing or harassment of women in public space is a frequent problem in your area, and a high 42% nationally said so. And as stunning was that in Karnataka, as many as 79% said that eve teasing was a frequent problem. We saw when it came to flouting traffic rules also, as many as 49% said they would do so, which means that every 1 out of 2 drivers were flouting or willing to flout traffic rules. And another barometer which we checked was whether there are areas in your neighborhood where you feel unsafe, and 1 out of 3 respondents, or 37%, said they felt unsafe. So if you take a look at public safety and then tie it up with what we said earlier, with a certain lack of compassion on these fronts, what is it that we're looking at as a society when you examine these 3 or 4 things that's there?
In matters of public safety or neighborhood, you know, ease of living in your neighborhood and trusting people around you. As I said earlier, much of this depends upon people you are familiar with, type of people you're familiar with. And that is unfortunately not the case in India, at least, with a vast difference in class, status, ways of life, and so forth, which is why there is a lack of empathy with the other. You will find that in societies which are primarily middle class societies, there's much greater empathy and public participation in such matters, and people do really stand up and object if somebody behaves badly, even though they may not be directly related to that incident. It is, in my view, the differences that are so vast between us in our country, not just in urban areas, but in rural areas too, that make this kind of empathy very difficult to surmount. We must, I think, as a basic condition, and this is something which is very difficult to obtain, and I'm just mentioning it, that is, as a basic condition, the society needs to be really middle class, where you might say that you and I have, in many ways, it's the same horizon. We participate in similar things, may not be the same things, in similar things. Now, how many people of our sort of middle class background would be happy to see their children play with the children of your staff? They
Right.
might say that they should play there. They're like us, they're like our children, and we look after them very well. But when it comes to socializing with them in schools or in the playground, you'll find many parents are very reluctant. In schools, for example, where they have admission for the economically backward students, you may have noticed some teachers have complained, and very loudly for a long period of time, that students who come in the economically weaker section are somehow, kept in the margins by those who are middle class upwards. It is this kind of distinction which has not really gone yet in our country. We made improvements, no doubt about it. But I found that in middle class society, in sections that are middle class, now all of Europe is not middle class, all of North Europe is not middle class either. But where the middle class element dominates, you will find a greater degree of empathy between people because similarity in lifestyles is a great leveler, which is
Right.
why I think that what we need to do is to work towards that. And it will happen, I hope, in the long run. But unless that happens, no matter how much we, thump our chest and beat the drum, you won't really find that kind of public participation and civic sympathy. It is the
But I,
sameness of everyday life that I think allows for this knitting together of people.
no, that's a very good point on it, and the middle classization of India could probably help sort a lot of these issues. I think the earlier point that you made when you look at traffic violations that we talk, such a high percentage willing to say that they would violate traffic rules. There, your point of tough penalties, harsh punishment would make a difference. Whether it's drinking and driving, as we saw in the US and other places, your license was suspended for 3 to 4 years or altogether, which makes you completely, hobbles you in a place like that where a car is an essential. And of course, taking very tough penalties. No one likes to pay even 1,000 rupees if they jump a traffic light. So there is a sense that, why waste money? And
As
therefore,
you
a
might
stricter
recall,
sort of
as,
monitoring of that would, I gather, help a lot
as you might
also.
recall, there was a time in the West where people resisted wearing seatbelts. They thought it
Right,
wasn't manly enough to wear seatbelts, and then over time, because it was made compulsory and the fine was pretty high, that seatbelts are being worn. And in India, remember the Commonwealth Games when that happened? We were
right,
told in Delhi to drive only on a certain side of the road and leave the other side for Commonwealth participants.
right,
I thought this rule would just not be obeyed by anybody. But because the police was very strict, I was amazed. Most people abided by that rule. So I think
right,
Indians can learn very fast, but they learn very
right,
fast only if the rules are enforced. And not just Indians, I'm sorry I said that. I think around the world, everywhere, people learn fast
right.
only if rules are actually implemented.
And,
In
and
India,
maybe the other aspect of it, Dipankar, is that awareness. I recall that for a long time, helmets were not being used by
exactly,
those
exactly.
motorbike people and scooters. And one of the things we did as a campaign was to actually look at head injuries and how serious those head injuries were for those who didn't have helmets. And rather than just do penalties, which I think is very important, education of the fact that you could injure yourself grievously if you didn't have a helmet, and the helmet could cut almost 80% of your injuries down, you still would have some. The same thing with car belts. We've seen our accidents where people don't strap up, they just go into the wheel, and
Yes,
damage
yes.
their ribs and everything else. So maybe that is another aspect that we need to look at, where apart from the penalties, we need to start an awareness campaign as to why these are not just being made for rules for you to observe, but it's for your own safety in some senses.
I think you've nailed it, Raj. Is of course implementation is very important, but in certain areas, I think you need an overload of information. We shouldn't say that we've talked enough about it and let's move on. For example, the anti-tobacco campaign, it was an
Right.
overload of information. All the time you're
That's
being
right.
told, no matter which way you looked, tobacco is bad for you. And this slowly seeps into your brain. It takes time.
Right.
But I think information overload in certain matters is very important. In fact, maybe that's the only cure that we have on issues like traffic, helmets, safety, because we are very uncaring about our own safety. If you see the way
Correct.
people
Yes.
drive, and only way out, I suppose, is information overload over and above uh,
Right.
uh, rule implementation.
And you're right about that. I remember I was smoking, when I was young and in college, and for a little while I was working, till I started writing on health issues. And once I wrote about cancer and also looked at someone who had an iron lung because he had smoked it to death in some senses. That's when I said, hey, I don't want to go down that road, and end up with ailments. So maybe as, the more serious and the more alarming you sound when you put out these things, it could be a great dissuader from, apart from the
Also, I
packets
think
that
it
you see.
depends. It also depends on at what age you strike.
Right,
I think the younger the person is, the more open and receptive they are. Of course, some of
right,
them grow up to be bad old men like me, but on the whole, by and large, if you get them young, then the
right,
chances are that they'll. I see young people today in our country as well as abroad, and I
right,
must say I'm quite impressed by the fact that they are better than we were in
right,
many ways. They have a greater degree of civic consciousness than we have. They're not
right.
as, gung ho about war and conquest like we were. So I think the younger
Right.
people are perhaps improving with time, and I hope I'm right on this one
No, let's give
occasion.
them credit. I mean, I know that the entire cracker movement, where,
Mm.
not to burst Diwali crackers, my children
Yes,
said, no way that we're doing it. And I know a
exactly.
lot
Look
of
at
people
that.
around us that decided that wasn't against it. Unfortunately, it is coming back in some ways. But let me come to
Mm.
another issue that is there, and this is the more difficult one to crack in some senses, and this is gender attitudes. And I'll give you just a couple of them that are indicative of the hypocrisy that exists in our society, particularly that came out through the survey. And when asked, one of the questions was whether female members should be encouraged to take up a job outside the home. 84% said yes, they should. But we know that the reality is that India has one of the lowest female work participation in our labor force. And then let's look
Yes.
at another question. Is a husband justified in beating his wife if she objects to his decisions regarding household
Yeah.
matters? Now, 83% of course said no, and yet 16% said it was okay. And in Andhra Pradesh, 31% of them, or 1 out of 3 surveyed, said it was okay for the husband to beat his wife over disagreements. And one more before we discuss the gender trap that is there, is, we asked one more question. Should male members of the household have the final say in a major household matter? And now as many as 69% said yes, with the percentage in Uttar Pradesh going up to 96%. Now, what do we do when how much of a gender bias is reflected in our society, and what do we need to change that? I mean, all across the world, and even in India, we've had an Indian women prime minister, chief ministers. What needs to be done to change this kind of attitude that's there?
Well, two things, Raj. The first is very quickly. The first one is the kind of discrepancy in the report itself, because you mentioned about UP and what the responses were in UP, and yet in your report, quite strangely, when it comes to whether women should work outside the home, Uttar Pradesh is number one. How
Correct.
can you explain that? And again, when it comes to Odisha, should women be free to take decisions outside in terms of the money they earn? Then the worst case is Odisha. And yet in Odisha alone, again, you find should daughters be allowed to study further? And yes, Odisha people said they should. So there's this kind of discrepancy that is there in the data, and be worthwhile for the survey analysts to take a little deeper look at it. On the other
Right.
hand, as you may have noticed, South India does much better than North India on civic issues.
Right.
Kerala, of course, is holding the torch way ahead of the rest, but Tamil Nadu is not too far behind. Now, one of the reasons I think is because in North India, there is this Kanyadan complex in marriage, where the bride giver is always inferior to the bride taker. The husband's side is superior to the wife's side. In some cases, in many cases actually, you also have the phenomenon of worshipping in the feet of the bridegroom, the father-in-law of the girl's father, doing Pau Puja. You know, now you don't have that in the south. In the south, that phenomenon does not exist. In fact, what happens in the south, and this is from Kerala up to some parts of Maharashtra, is cross cousin marriage. And when you have cross cousin marriage, then this kind of Kanyadan complex is obviously absent. And I think to a large extent, women's position in society depends on this fact and the kind of coordinates that this fact throws up. In South India and Maharashtra, when I was to do my field work there, I was quite impressed by the fact that women from villages would board the bus unhesitatingly and not worry about the number of men that were around, which would not have been the case in some parts of North India.
Right.
So I think the kinship factor and marriage factor is very important because girls are taught from the young age in most homes, things are was changing now. That when you go to in-laws' home, you must start again, you must learn new things, etc., etc. Whereas in South India, that kind of burden is not there. I won't call it a burden. I think the incubus of the fear of what will happen after I get married to women that doesn't exist in the same way. And
Very good. Yeah.
I'm quite surprised why this aspect has not been dilated upon more often. You'll find this also in terms of farmers' suicides and everywhere. This aspect of women being equal to men in a home, and this can be seen or tracked through marriage rules, is, I think, quite a significant issue that we should
Very
pay more
good point.
attention to.
Yeah. We'll do that in the last point in this, on the last section as we see it, is that the survey deals with diversity and discrimination in society. And one of the questions we asked to check that out was, do resident associations or housing societies have the right to prohibit certain types of food, such as meat or beef, to be cooked in individual apartments? Now, as many as 54% said they do not have a right to do so nationally, and that number went up to 75% in Uttarakhand and in other states. Of course, Kerala was exactly the reverse, where 88% were opposed to any kind of ban on types of food in their locality. Then another quick question was, should a man and woman be free to marry each other even if they are different religions? Now here, as many as 61% disagreed, with Chandigarh registering 90%. Somewhat the same results came when it came to caste. Asked whether a man and woman would be free to marry each other even if they came from different castes. Here again, 56% disapproved nationally, and in Uttar Pradesh the figure went up to 84%. So when it comes to these issues, and religion also, there's been a question about it, whether you take of object to employing people of other religion. That also had some interesting findings. What do you see when you look at diversity and discrimination? What does it tell us of our society?
Well, I think the first point, that in South India, again, Kerala, there are streets ahead of North India. That point is well made. But one can't explain it really in simplistic terms. Of course, some people have tried to argue, not unconvincingly, that because the Muslims came to South India by boat and not on horseback, and that makes a big difference in the way they integrated with the society, or the society accepted them. That's one part of the story. But as we know, in the South too, there's a fair amount of discrimination and animosity, but not to the same level as in parts of North India. The other explanation which is usually offered is that of partition. And because the trauma of partition was felt more in the North than in the South, that could also be a case. But the interesting feature here, I'd like to add, though Punjab has got a pretty bad knock on in this survey, that when I was looking at Punjab in the bad days of the Sikh extremism, I was quite surprised that partition was never used by Sikh politicians to whip up support. Unlike in other parts of India, where the Hindu politicians were involved, partition plays a very important role. Whereas in Sikh politics, partition doesn't seem to matter that much, though Sikhs suffered a lot during the partition. I mean, they died and they killed and all that stuff happened. But it doesn't figure in their political statements or political participation, which is a puzzle to me. So as I think that, you have asked me a question for which I don't have a complete answer, except for these snippets of impressions from horseback and ship and partition. And one of the reasons why in Punjab it doesn't figure so prominently, I think, is because some of the three ICS officers who were in charge of resettlement of Punjabi refugees thought of something absolutely brilliant. What they did was they transported entire villages from Pakistan to India. The same people were put together in a different locality. So sociologically, they were the same, though they were geographically in different position. So they didn't feel that alienation that many others did. That is probably one explanation. I don't know.
Well, the idea of this survey is to hold a mirror to society. We don't know a lot of the answers, and that is the role that the media plays. No survey is perfect, but hopefully this will provoke public discourse on our civic behavior. And we felt that the idea of development could be enriched with such markers that could have tangible economic effects. Again, these are in the realm of lack of quantifiable evidence to that. But thank you, Dipankar.
Even if it's not completely quantifiable, as I told you earlier, what really comes through is the fact that people seem to know what the right thing to do. Right. And second is the great, I would say, overlap between rural and urban sentiments. I would have normally thought it would differ a lot, but that has not happened. It could be because much of rural areas is getting urban. Because people in rural areas are not always working on agriculture. They're also looking outside the mud walls of the world beyond. So that could be one reason. But it is very interesting. The rural and urban responses are not that wide apart as one would have expected them to be. Gross domestic behavior, much of it is, of course, gross, but the domestic behavior is worth looking at carefully. Thank you
But
very much.
thank you so much, Dipankar Gupta, for this, your insights and your lucid comments on all these issues. They still are nebulous, as I said, in terms of the survey. Some of the results will have to be debated far more, but thank you for taking time out to speak to me. So there you have it, the big survey that we have done on gross domestic behavior. One of the big things that Dipankar Gupta talked about was not only just education being the key to civic consciousness, but it also must be taught and learnt, and enforcement too is absolutely vital. Plus, education, as we said, creating awareness of the ills of these and the benefits that by cleaning up your cities or our cities and not littering garbage, it will not only improve people's health, but attract tourists from all over the world and help us be more productive as well as earn income. These are benefits that are there. There are many more that we could talk about, but as I said, this is the first of its kind survey, and I would suggest that for more information, do look at the latest issue of India Today, which carries the in-depth study that is there with all the questions and also analysis as well. Thank you for those who have tuned into this episode of Nothing But the Truth, and I look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing But the Truth.